This is a presentation about a different aspect of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. How many of you know Buffalo Bill and Buffalo Bill's Wild West, or have been to the Buffalo Bill Museum? We tend to think of, there he is. If you don't know, there's Buffalo Bill in his show costume. And this is how we tend to think of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Cowboys and Indians and stagecoaches and all those exciting and colorful elements that made up the Old West, the romance of the Old West as William F. Cody wanted people to understand it, the West that marked the frontier era and the settlement of the frontier. So that was the Wild West as people knew it. But there were other things about the Wild West which people also saw, which we tend not to talk about as much, but which to me, I think, to me at least, are as fascinating as the emphasis on the Old West. Again, the cowboys and cowgirls, as I said. This is a quote from a newspaper article in 1893, which talked about the most varied and curious assembly of nationalities ever brought together. And this presentation is about that international aspect of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, which really was remarkable for its time and unlike anything that people had seen in their experience. Another quote, "This is the Wild West of today, such a mingling of men, people from all over the world brought together." This is a photograph of one of the villages that made up the camps that traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West. You can see on the center there are Indian teepees. There were also wall tents, Sibley tents that were used by cavalrymen from many nations in Europe as well as from the U.S. There were all sorts of nationalities represented, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So there's a picture of the earth. And one of the things that I think is very striking that William F. Cody's Buffalo Bill's Wild West employed as performers representatives from all of the continents except for Antarctica. It was really one of the most international presentations, certainly traveling presentations of its kind. And there are just a few of the countries that we know from our records were represented in Buffalo Bill's Wild West: the Philippines, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Japan, South America, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, a number of Asian nations in Europe. Argentina is on there, South Africa. So I want to back up a little bit and talk generally, because I think this is also relevant to contemporary debates today and debates that we frankly have struggled with as a country ever since our founding. What is the role of immigration? Who is an American? Who is qualified to be considered an American? Who fits under that large umbrella? America, as we know, we celebrate, just last week we celebrated our independence as a nation, and we talked about values of freedom and liberty, this wonderful image from an early 19th century engraving, America, the Tree of Liberty. We still like to think of ourselves as the greatest nation of liberty on the planet. But immigration has been a challenge to that notion. How porous do we want to be? How expansive do we want to be in allowing people other than the initial settlers to come into our country? And what do we do with them when they're here? What are our expectations about whether they will hold on to their original culture or assimilate into what we consider to be an American culture? How tolerant are we of diversity? Again, the great image from the mid-1880s onward of welcome, the Statue of Liberty welcoming people, the teeming masses from all over the world, and the sense that we were open to people from all over the world. But even back then, just as in our time, there were a lot of debates about how far this should go. And depending on which nationality or race you wanted to focus on, you could be very restrictive in your views, very intolerant of who was really allowed to be here. The Irish, African Americans were here first as slaves and then as free blacks. Certainly by the mid-19th century, Chinese and Japanese immigrants coming here, as well as people coming from South America, from other nations. Do they have a right to be here? Do we assimilate people into the mainstream, or do we allow a heterogeneous abundance of cultures here? And particularly if those new arrivals don't appear to be of the same stock as the Anglo-European, the Northern European stock, which is the primary stock of the settlers who initially came here. If they look different, if they act different, if they speak differently, if they behave differently, how inclusive are we going to be? And a lot of fear. Here is a cartoon from the 1880s talking about Chinese laborers being allowed into this country and whether or not, clearly in this person's view, we solved the problem by letting the Chinese devour themselves. The 19th century was really the kind of the scientific discovery of race as an aspect of human identity, that there were clear and obvious differences, primarily related to skin color, but also in terms of facial structure, that seemed to differentiate one group of people from another group of people. And this is also the time when evolution is really coming into vogue. So a lot of this gets tied up into notions of who are the more advanced, the more civilized, and the less civilized. Lots of analysis of skulls and facial structure and so forth. Evolution from a societal level, from primitive to more civilized. So a lot of discussion about differences, about different cultures, about different peoples, but a lot of it based in fear. Different groups would point to science and use science to justify whatever they happen to believe or uphold. And in some ways, a very closed time. Well, how did people, most Americans, encounter others, people who are not like themselves? Unless you lived in a city that was a major immigration port, like New York or New Orleans, your chances of encountering others were fairly low. One opportunity, one avenue for encountering other cultures was through art. There's a depiction of Indians from the early 19th century, and obviously emphasizing their clothing, their mannerisms as being different from what we tended to associate with. World's fairs were a way for people to encounter others. If you had the good fortune to live in a city that hosted a World's Fair, or if you visited a city that had a World's Fair. New York had the first one in 1853. There were others in places like Chicago. Chicago had the Columbian Exposition in 1893. Philadelphia had the Centennial Exposition in 1876. New Orleans had one in 1884. Many large cities hosted these expositions, and they invited other countries to participate. And so the other nations would provide exhibits and displays, and in many cases would send people from their country who would present their different lifestyles, the different cultures. So World's Fairs were certainly another way to encounter others. And here, for example, is a photograph of the Japanese Pavilion at the Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. This building is actually still there. If you have ever been to Philadelphia, you can visit it's now called it's like the Japanese Tea Room or something like that. I saw it in Fairmount Park. It's a beautiful building. But these pavilions, these exhibitions were ways for people to encounter representatives from other cultures. Well, let's come back to William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. Again, as he is remembered most often as Buffalo Bill, you see him there with his Stetson hat, with his colorful embroidered shirts, with his thigh-high boots and up on a horse and holding a rifle. I mean, that's clearly Buffalo Bill. Well, William F. Cody is, I want to talk a little bit about him and give you some information about him, as opposed to Buffalo Bill, who is really a character. William F. Cody was born and lived the first few years of his life at what was literally the crossroads of America. If you've been out to our garden to see Buffalo Bill's boyhood home, which he lived in from 1849 to 1853, it was actually moved here from a little town called LeClaire, Iowa, on the west bank of the Mississippi River. William F. Cody, as a young boy, young Will, could stand in his front yard and the Mississippi River was right there, flowing past his door. That was the main north-south interstate commerce route. You know, traffic was steamships and barges, and other ships were moving down the Mississippi River and also coming back upstream. And so there was a lot of traffic moving back and forth, and he was there. He also happened to be just a few miles north of one of the main east-west crossroads, which today is Interstate 80. It's about 10 miles below LeClaire. That was one of the main avenues. It wasn't a paved road, obviously, back then. It was a dirt highway, but it was one of the main wagon routes for people moving from the east to the west, and also for the shipment of goods from the west back to the east. So Cody's right there. I mean, he's literally right at the intersection of a lot of traffic, a lot of movement of people. Again, this emphasizes people on the move with Conestoga wagons. By the 1850s, certainly railroads were much more prevalent than they had been. A lot of mobility in this country, and Cody was right at the center of it. The point is that we would tend to think of Iowa and Kansas, where he moved when he was about 11, as being very homogeneous. A lot of poor farmers, poor settlers, and you would think that it would be almost entirely a white population. Well, the reality is it was a very diverse population that William F. Cody lived in. He knew and closely associated with free blacks. A lot of them had escaped from slavery via the Underground Railroad and had come to Kansas, which was a free state, had been voted as a free state. There were still vestiges of slavery around him. He certainly saw slavery in Iowa and in nearby Illinois. In the 1860s, during the Civil War and after the Civil War, immediately after the Civil War, he actually guided for Buffalo soldiers, the African-American colored soldiers, the colored troops. Also in this area where Cody was living were a lot of Mexican cowboys called Vaqueros, who were coming north helping drive cattle from Texas and from the Southwest, essentially training American cowboys on how to work with cattle. So you've got African Americans, you've got Mexicans, you've got people from all sorts of other countries coming through on their way, presumably to wherever they were heading. So it's a very, very diverse world that William F. Cody is living in. A lot of people know Buffalo Bill or William F. Cody as an Indian-Slayer. In fact, we get either asked or we hear charges that Cody was this bloodthirsty slayer of Indians, a notion which he himself helped perpetuate. On the left is a painting which you can see in our Whitney Gallery of Western Art about the first scalp for Custer, about this duel that took place in 1876 where Cody went into combat in the Indian Wars and had a duel with a Cheyenne sub-chief named Yellow Hand and killed him and scalped him. And this was a couple of months after the Battle of Little Bighorn and Custer's death there. And Cody supposedly brandished this saying, "the first scalp for Custer." On the right is a photograph of an exhibit that Cody himself created and that he traveled with his theatrical company, the Buffalo Bill Combination. During the 1870s, he actually created a play, or had a play created about the duel with Yellow Hand, and this museum exhibit had in it Yellow Hand's headdress, the scalp, a revolver, and a Bowie knife that Cody confiscated, and other kind of gruesome relics of this scalping to underscore this notion of Cody as an Indian slayer. Well, there's a different side to that, a different story that many people do not know. In fact, I was unaware of until I started reading Cody's autobiography. When he moved to Kansas as a young boy in 1854 with his father was a trader. He started a trading post in an area called the Salt Creek Valley and essentially traded with Indians who lived there. The Potawatomie, the Kickapoo, the Delaware, other woodland Indians that a lot of them had been displaced from the upper Midwest and eastern Midwest where they had settled. They were moving westward themselves and settled in Iowa and in Kansas. But Cody's father, Isaac Cody, traded with Indians. And he had a store, and there were constantly, every day, lots of Indians there coming to the store. And as Cody himself, young Cody, said, hardly a day passed without a social visit from the Indians. I spent a great deal of time with the Indian boys, taking part in all their sports, and learned to talk their language to some extent. The Potawatomie, the Kickapoo, taught him Indian language. They taught him how to use a bow and arrow. They taught him lacrosse and other games. And so for many years, roughly from the age of 11 up till the age of about 16, William F. Cody's primary playmates were Indians. And that's quite a different view of from Cody the Indian-Slayer. Essentially, Cody was a pragmatist. You learn to get along. You learn to coexist with people. Unless you had some reason to believe that they were out to get you, you learned tolerance, and you learned, essentially, you did what you needed to do to get by. So in 1873, William F. Cody forms this theatrical company that travels around the country, hosting and performing plays about life on the frontier. Cody became one of the best-known actors in America well before he started Buffalo Bill's Wild West by performing these plays set in the frontier West. And he had people like Wild Bill Hickok. He had Texas Jack Omohundro in there for a few years. He had other people who had been scouts with him and cowboys and so forth. And oh, by the way, he employed Indians. Just as in Buffalo Bill's Wild West, he wanted things to be authentic, and so he recruited Pawnee and Kickapoo and other Indians and brought them on stage with him, wearing their war clothing, wearing their actual native culture, and interacted with them. You can see on the photograph on the right there, some of the Indians that were part of his company. He paid good wages. He paid them the same as he did his other actors. And he made that a hallmark of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, that he paid his Indians the same amount of money he paid his other performers, and they really respected and admired him for that. So we're now up to 1883 in Buffalo Bill's Wild West. On the left is a broadside, a handbill from the first season of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, which again had cowboys and sharpshooting demonstrations and attacks on stagecoaches, and again had Indians as horse riders, demonstrating equestrian abilities, Indians demonstrating Indian dancing, and also participating in some of the acts like the attack on the Deadwood stagecoach and so forth. An exhibition of the characteristics of Western frontier life is how Cody built it, and indeed it was. It had all of these things: the life on the ranch, the prairie fire, mining camps, the death of Custer at Little Bighorn. And again, Indians figured prominently in these, and some of them became very famous. Irontail is probably the best example. The Indian whose face graces the buffalo head nickel, the Indian on there is Irontail. And of course, many people know that Sitting Bull, the famous Sioux warrior, Sioux chief, traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West for a year in 1884, and Cody and Sitting Bull became good friends. In 1893, Cody's partner Nathan Salisbury was looking for ways to help beef up Buffalo Bill's Wild West. They had been in Europe for about 5 years, from 1887 to 1892, traveling all through Europe. And Salisbury, who himself was a rancher and a breeder of fine horses, as was Cody, took to going to watch feats of horsemanship wherever he could find them. He'd go to horse races, he'd go to breeding stables, he'd go to circuses, and he was really smitten by equestrian acts, and particularly acts that showed horsemen from other nations of the world. And he said to Cody, you know, we got to think about expanding our offering. We got to keep it fresh, we got to keep it current. So when they came back to the United States in 1893, to Chicago, to display right outside the grounds of the World's Fair, they weren't allowed into the World's Fair, they started this Congress of Rough Riders of the World as a way of showcasing the abilities of riders from other nations. And so that kind of marked a turning point in Buffalo Bill's Wild West. They brought in Mexican Vaqueros, South American Gauchos, and others, as we'll see. And descriptions, one can imagine a kaleidoscope from all the nations, was one of the descriptions that was given about Buffalo Bill's Wild West. People, newspaper reporters, marveling at the diversity that you could see by attending a performance. So when you were entering Buffalo Bill's Wild West, as these people are walking into the gates, you were entering a very different world. You were entering the world of the Old West. But you could also walk through the grounds, walk through the camp, and interact with the performers as they lived in their camps, including the Indians, including the Mexicans, the Arabs, the Gauchos. This became, in fact, one of the big drawing cards for Buffalo Bill's Wild West in 1893, and then the following year in Brooklyn in 1894 was the opportunity to spend time walking through the camps and talking, interacting with the people who were living there. Native Americans, again, this is just a small troop of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. At one point, Cody had as many as 150 Indians associated with Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Here's a scene in the Indian village. The Indians, again, if you know, without getting too far afield here, but if you know anything about the history of Native Americans, in the aftermath of the Indian Wars of the 1870s, 1880s, Indian Wars ended in 1891, Indians were largely confined to reservations as an aspect of U.S. federal policy. And on the reservations, they were prohibited from displaying their culture. They had to live in very simple tents. They could not live in embellished teepees. They could not wear native clothing. They were given quote-unquote American clothing to wear. They were forbidden from speaking in their native language. The children were taught English. So for Indians who performed with Buffalo Bill's Wild West, this was a godsend to them, because Cody, again underscoring his desire for authenticity, not only allowed them to display their native culture, but actually encouraged and welcomed displays of culture because it made it more authentic. So they wore the clothing that they had worn before the reservation days. They cooked the way they had cooked before the reservation days. The braves dressed as warriors and wore headdresses and loincloths and so forth, painted themselves with different colors. The Indian women had babies in papooses and young children. They did beadwork. Some of them did beadwork for Buffalo Bill and for other members of the company. But you could really walk through these camps and see as close to a real Indian village as you were likely to encounter in your lifetime, unless you happened to travel out to the west and find Indians who had managed to avoid living on a reservation. Here's a wonderful photograph that shows women and children wearing blankets, You see behind them the teepees that have the native iconography that they've put on there. And there's a wonderful kind of hand-tinted photograph of children wearing native apparel. And I mean, they're just dressed in all sorts of different types of outfits there. I mentioned Sitting Bull. There he is on the left with Cody, and on the right is Iron Tail. Probably the two most famous performers with Buffalo Bill's Wild West, Indian performers, Native American performers. But there were many others. Again, hundreds of Native Americans who appeared with Buffalo Bill's Wild West. There were also African Americans, initially as support staff. If you look closely at the photograph, you will see some of the canvasmen, some of the African Americans who were employed to help erect tents. And they also worked as cooks and did other kinds of behind-the-scenes operations. But by the 1890s, and certainly by 1900, they were also appearing as performers, appearing as buffalo soldiers, appearing as members of the U.S. colored troops, appearing as equestrian riders. And again, Cody insisted on paying them the same wage that he paid his other performers. He made no difference, drew no difference between black, white, yellow, whatever color you were, whatever gender you were. Wanted everybody to be paid the same wage, which for his time was really progressive, really remarkable that he insisted on that kind of pay equity. There's a group of buffalo soldiers in a parade for Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And beyond the Native Americans and the African Americans, there was this diversity of other nations. Here is a little sketch from 1893 in Chicago. On the left, here's a quote from the New York Times, and the main tent was a conglomeration of all races. There the cowboy band was practicing with coat collars turned up and hats on. Japanese were tossing each other into somersaults with their feet and twirling barrels with their toes to an audience of Cossacks, Mexicans, and Dahamans. Dahamans is another word for Arabs. So some of the groups that were particularly prominent or featured in Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the Mexican Vaqueros, pretty much the same vaqueros that Cody had encountered on the plains in Kansas, with their sombreros, their big spurs on the big wheels, the rowels on their spurs. There are lots of Mexicans who performed as acrobats, as rope throwers, as lassoers, and so forth. Georgian Cossacks. It's one of the most interesting ethnic groups represented at Buffalo Bill's Wild West. The Cossacks, who came from what is now the Republic of Georgia, used to be part of the Soviet Union, the Urals area in South Europe, beginning in 1893, when, again through the influence of Nathan Salisbury, when Cody began his Congress of Rough Riders, Georgian Cossacks were among the first he selected. Salisbury had seen Cossacks riding in parades and in other places in Europe. He was really taken by their equestrian skills. They really prided themselves on horsemanship, doing a lot of trick riding, and they wore these incredible costumes. And so the Cossacks were featured for their thrills, the riding spectacles that they did, for their acrobatics, for things like riding and picking up handkerchiefs and balancing on one leg or something like that. Here they're engaged in a horse race, and you can imagine being in the crowd and seeing this group of Georgians with their very colorful costumes. They had these kind of shields on, and they look like something actually out of the Middle Ages, riding in and racing with these very athletic horses. And there they are with some of their headdresses and their long robes, very much unlike what most Americans were familiar with. Argentinian gauchos, the cowboys from the Pampas of Argentina, and also from Chile. Some of the original cattle ranchers, dating back to the time of the Spanish settlement of South America after 1500. The cowboys who grew out of that tradition were, again, some of the featured performers for Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And Like the Cossacks, they did acrobatics. They also took bolas, and they would show how they used the bolas, almost like an American cowboy would use a lasso. They would do demonstrations of bolo throwing and so forth. Riffian Arabs. Nomadic Arabs wandering primarily through places like North Africa, Morocco, Libya, other places in North Africa. Cody brought many Arabs here, probably 3 or 4 dozen of them at the peak in time around around 1900. Again, looking very much unlike anything that people had been familiar with, dressed in veils and turbans and shawls, and living in tents that were unlike the tents that soldiers lived in. Their tents were called dromedaries, and they looked like they were made up of layers of cloth draped very carefully to make a framework. They had Persian rugs. Again, very much unlike what people were familiar with. And again, horsemanship and acrobatics that they were featured for. Filipino horsemen. There were horsemen from Australia, from New Guinea, from New Zealand, from other parts of Asia. Japanese horsemen and samurai warriors. Samurai warriors would give demonstrations of swordsmanship during performances of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. So, again, this notion of a cosmopolitan Wild West. One of Cody's employees talked about the exhibition might be termed a polyglot school. Anybody know what the word polyglot means? Many languages, many tongues. By some estimates, there were as many as 30 different languages being spoken at Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And that's pretty amazing. Also made for some difficulties in communication, as we'll see in a moment. In fact, here, how are you going to get these people to communicate? For Cody, it's a real problem. He learned a little bit of Indian language, but he couldn't speak it very well. And he had representatives from various tribes who themselves would not be able to speak the dialect or the language of that particular Indian tribe. Well, the solution was with the Lakota Sioux. Lakota Sioux, who were part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, taught sign language to other nations. So you had the Cossacks and the Gauchos and the Germans and the Irish and whoever able to communicate with one another using sign language that the Lakota Sioux had taught. We have this wonderful little video snippet. I think you can see part of it in the film footage, which is on display in the Wild West alcove in the Buffalo Bill Museum, of Cody sitting outside of a tent with Iron Tail and communicating in sign language that he learned from Lakota Sioux who had traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West. This is a wonderful picture of the dressing room, and this reporter's note that in the dressing room was the most thoroughly cosmopolitan scene. You walk into the dressing room and you would see all these people getting dressed in their native costumes, native outfits, and you might find an Englishman next to a Boer from South Africa, next to a Japanese, or next to a Gaucho. It's just a very, very diverse and wonderful range and array of colors and textures and different articles of clothing as people were getting dressed. Again, what a democratic multitude it was. The sense that this was just a group of people from all over. In fact, I have a little quote here to read about the dining hall. Within 2 minutes, the big dining tent was full, and the caterers were busily engaged in feeding the multitude. And what a democratic multitude it was. Colonel Cody's managers and representatives, pleasant, well-educated men, who were in receipt of big salaries, sat down to supper a few yards away from the band of Indians who had one table for themselves. The Arabs ate cheek by jowl with a Cossack prince, with Mexicans, with Irishmen, with Scotchmen, with Englishmen, Germans, gauchos, Frenchmen and Negroes were dining under the same roof, eating the same food. Yes, we have all the same rations, said Mr. Fellows, the press agent, when I asked if there was any difference in the fare. Of course, sometimes those foreigners may cook some queer dish for themselves, but when they do, it is eaten in a quiet corner. The sense of meals being partaken by all the different groups there, just like the dressing tent, you would go and you would see the diversity of performers and cultures there. And some wonderful backstage photographs and backstage scenes. This wonderful photograph of a group of Indians playing ping pong as some other Indians watch, and behind them you can see a group of soldiers. I'm not sure where they're from, but lots of references to diversity. The most notable feature of the whole business, however, is the conglomeration of nationalities to be found inside the show. A peep into one of the tents yesterday, this is a newspaper article from about 1900. A peep into one of the tents yesterday disclosed the fact that a Mexican was shaving a Rough Rider. A few yards away, groups of Cossacks were conversing, and a short distance further were some Cubans. All of the men appear to live, work, and play together under conditions of the most complete harmony. Now, I don't want to push that so far that it makes it sound like some sort of utopian Shangri-La, because certainly there were differences. There were differences, as in any large camp of people. You're going to get conflicts over whatever, over drinking, or somebody will look at somebody the wrong way and a fight will break out. But by and large, every evidence seems to suggest that it was a very harmonious outfit of people. They had one another's back, to use a phrase that we use today. They watched out for one another. They complained if they saw representatives of one group being treated unfairly. They were very vocal to reporters about that. This is one of my favorite images here, this wonderful drawing from 1892 of a group playing dice. And a reporter said, "I've never heard that the North American Indian played at dice, but he can play pitch and toss with the best of us. So can the gaucho and the Mexican and the cowboy and the Cossack and the Britisher." I mean, what a tableau that is of the diversity of the Wild West. In what was arguably one of the earliest World Series, in 1892, when Buffalo Bill's Wild West was performing in England, Cody fielded a ball team made up of representatives from his cowboys, which also included some of his vaqueros and some of his gauchos who had joined the show. And they played a London team in a three-game playoff. And I'm happy to say, I won't offend any Britishers out there, but the Americans took it to the Brits 2-1. And won, again, this baseball game played in England. And again, you see, looking from behind, the diversity there of the vaqueros, it looks like an Arabian woman there, or an Arab standing off to the right, or maybe a Cossack, Native Americans there, and Cody himself with his Stetson hat right there in the center. Just as in this country, when Buffalo Bill's Wild West traveled overseas, there was a lot of commentary on the diversity. People were struck by this, not only by visiting the camps, but also by seeing the performers walking around. This newspaper article here, From Pampas to Pavement, talks about a group of gauchos who were taken to Westminster Abbey and to Buckingham Palace and saw the other sites in London. A number of times the Native Americans in particular were taken to meet royalty. They performed in front of Queen Victoria and so forth. So people, again, in places like Britain, were able to see members of other cultures walking in their midst. It's one of my favorite stories. This is a woman who was the wife, one of the many wives of a sheikh named Zahar ben Tahar. Her name was Zahar ben Tahar. The sheikh, who was the head of the Riffian Arabs, had several wives, and this young woman, Zahar Ben Tahar, came with him and lived in Brooklyn when Buffalo Bill's Wild West was performing in Brooklyn. She was interviewed by a reporter in 1894, and she told this wonderful story. She says, "I have been to New York. I went to a great bazaar called Macy's, far greater than any in Tangiers. It was hard for the imagination to understand it. I saw cars that went without anyone pushing or pulling, and I thought there must be devils inside. I did not go on them, but on a railroad high up in the air. I was afraid it would fall down, but it did not. At Macy's, the people stopped buying to look at me. They came all about us so that we could not pass. Everywhere were women's faces, so many that I could not tell whether any of them were beautiful. The women crowded around me so that I could not move. They talked to me, but I did not know what they said. Their voices sounded like the voices of the birds that we have in our country. I just kept saying, 'Arab, Arab.' The women pushed each other and used their elbows. At last, some of the men of the store rescued me. An Arab boy, she had traveled with a young Arab boy as kind of her guide. And we were taken to the Oriental part. The Macy's store clerks figured that she must be there to buy Oriental rugs, and so they took her and left her in the Oriental rug section. There I found much goods that I recognized. We bought much. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when we went out to go home. But we got on the wrong railroad, and it took us far off to Harlem. All I could say was, "Buffalo Bill," and no one understood me. It was 1:30 in the morning when I got back to this place. The sheik had been running everywhere like mad looking for me. "Oh, where were you?" he cried. "See," I said, "I have bought everything in the city, and here is the bill." So she quickly learned to acclimate herself to American culture. So the point here, I think, the ultimate point is that at a time when there were lots of challenges about immigration, lots of debates about assimilation or respecting other cultures, lots of debates about who was an American, who should be an American, who was allowed to be here, William F. Cody and Buffalo Bill's Wild West were sounding a far different note, a message of unity, a message of how we are essentially all one brother, how we are all linked, and a message of tolerance and respect for other cultures. Towards the end of his career, Cody became somewhat of an ambassador of goodwill, very consciously styled himself as this and wanted to capitalize on this notion. And this is an article from 1910, which really gets to this point. Colonel Cody carried the Star-Spangled Banner to many remote and distant points in foreign lands. Its enthusiastic reception when brought in close contact face to face with the highest as well as the masses of the people showed that what it represented met a representative chord, a responsive chord in the hearts of all. On these lines, he has assembled the different flags together at home and abroad, with the warriors of different nations to rally around and show the soldiers' preference for the white emblem of amity, the white emblem of friendship, of peace between nations, of international goodwill and cooperation. He ended the show on that note, waving this flag of amity in front of the flags of all the other nations that were represented with Buffalo Bill's Wild West. William F. Cody died in 1917, January of 1917, just as the United States was getting involved in a horrible war then waging in Europe. Cody himself was born in 1846 when the United States was involved in a war in Mexico. And so his life was bookended by 2 wars. And one of the sorrows of his life was that fact that he was born at a time when a nation was at war, and he died at a time when the nation was at war. He really wanted to promulgate this notion of international brotherhood, this notion of peace and goodwill. And I think in some ways, as much as we honor his legacy for Buffalo Bill's Wild West and for introducing us to these iconic images of cowboys and Indians, in this day and age, we should also honor him for that message of amity, for the message of peace. I think it's a message that would resonate in our time as much as it did in his. Thank you.